The Vietnam War, Propaganda and its Effects. The Vietnam War was a very impactful event, both in its political impacts and warfare implications. In a sense, it was an omen of what was to come in modern warfare. Although opinions differ on the war, many people agree that the US lost, which begs the question, why?
The Cold War period, 1947 to 1991, was a time of international fear and animosity, particularly towards any left-leaning countries. The United States went to war with Vietnam because of North Vietnam's communist leanings and lost due to the popularity of the revolution and the subsequent support for the insurgency. The US and the South Vietnamese tried to sway the public's opinion with different forms of propaganda to gain support among Vietnamese people. Both the US and the Viet Cong tried many avenues of communication to spread their propaganda. The Viet Cong's propaganda was way more successful because they appealed to the needs of the nation's past, and against the US actions during the war.
Today we're going to be exploring why North Vietnamese propaganda was more effective than anything that the US tried during the war. However, we first have to understand what led up to the war to understand the rhetoric bolstered by both sides.
The world 100 years ago was dominated by the great European powers. Their power was mainly derived from imperialism. The land they conquered made them power players. In the year 1800, European colonies covered about 50% of the world's landmass. By 1914, this number rose to about 85%. In the 20th century, imperialism was justified with social Darwinism. Social Darwinism says that survival of the fittest plays out in societies as well as nature. And since Europe was the first to develop quote-unquote society, they were superior to the others. By some reasoning, the Europeans thought they were doing a favor to these places by bringing culture and the advancements of quote-unquote civilized society. Rudyard Kipling, an English journalist, called this ludicrous notion the white man's burden. Europe as a world entity shrank. The world wars crippled them. When the British ultimatum to Germany expired, causing the First World War, the Foreign Secretary was watching the lamps go out across London and said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." Some thought the Treaty of Versailles was unstable and would lead to a second general European war. As General Ferdinand Foch put it, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years, a chillingly accurate prediction." Cost of the world wars, the colonies started to unwind. These new nations were suddenly caught up in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were bound to start competing on the world stage simply because they were the two superpowers left, who had massively different political ideologies. The Soviet Union was socialist, and the government was totalitarian. The United States was capitalist and was a representative democracy. This set the tone for a period of intense competition on the world stage. As Gorbachev put it while talking about Reagan, it seems like the most important thing about Reagan was his anti-communism and his reputation as a hawk who saw the Soviet Union as an evil empire, end quote. The United States thought once one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would soon follow. This idea was called the domino theory. The European Soviet bloc, or the Iron Curtain as Churchill had called it, would serve as proof of the domino theory. The Soviet bloc was a group of nations in Europe that had fallen under Soviet control during the Second World War. The Soviets had set up allied socialist puppet governments in those places. The new nations, free from colonialism, would see their genuine political movements be swept up and used as proxies for these two powers as they clashed for power, never engaging directly due to the threat of all-out nuclear war, instead engaging in drawn-out proxy wars that threw the newly freed Third World into chaos. As British espionage author John le Carré put it, the Cold War provided the perfect excuse for Western governments to plunder and exploit the Third World in the name of freedom, to rig its elections, bribe its politicians, appoint its tyrants, and by every sophisticated means of persuasion and interference, stun the emergence of young democracies in the name of democracy. Vietnam was no exception to this broad trend on the world stage.
Vietnam is a former French colony turned communist by a self-determination movement within the country. We'll be exploring Vietnam's context through the eyes of a key player named Ho Chi Minh, who played a major role in starting the revolution. Ho grew up in the upper class of Vietnam. As a result, Ho attended a French boarding school in Hue called the National Academy. Ho's education at a French school made him bilingual and able to express his thoughts in a well-regimented and persuasive manner. After finishing his studies in 1911, Ho took up a job as a waiter on a boat and traveled around the world as a result. He is said to have lived in New York for a short time, when his ship sailed there in 1912. This journey shocked him. Immigrants in the US had the right to vote when they became citizens, a right that the Vietnamese people had been denied.
Ho moved to Paris in 1917 and started to write for an anti-colonial newspaper, which got him kicked out of the colony of Vietnam. Ho even attended the Treaty of Versailles to lobby for fair treatment of colonial subjects. However, this changed in 1920 when he helped found the Communist Party of France and traveled to Moscow in 1923 and met with Bolshevik officials. It is here he became a Soviet agent for revolution in Vietnam and was sent to China in 1924 to start laying the groundwork for revolution. From here, it is extremely hard to say where he went and with whom he met. During the Second World War, he emerged from exile and led his people in a revolt against the occupying Japanese forces. Ho was described as, quote, an awfully sweet guy by the OSS, precursors to the CIA. Ho's forces were eventually known as the Viet Minh.
After the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh declared the former colony independent and set up a government. In the official post-war agreement, the French and the British would occupy Vietnam up to the 16th parallel, and anything above would be given to China, who allowed Ho to rule. The French began a fierce counterinsurgency to quell the cries for revolution, and eventually ventured past the 16th parallel. This started an all-out war in 1964. Over the next 8 years, the insurgency continued under the leadership of Ho. At the Geneva Convention, the issue was settled. The 17th parallel was to be the new border between South and North Vietnam, with reunification elections being held 2 years from the agreement. The South Vietnamese government failed to hold reunification elections for the fear that Ho would have won. With this, the Viet Cong were set up in the South, a movement supported by the North's vast resources and allies. The stage was set for an intervention by the U.S.
Part 3. North Vietnamese Propaganda.
Simply put, propaganda is a form of media that shifts public opinion in a political discussion.
This photo is a book cover. The first thing that is noticeable is the depiction of Vietnamese fighters. This symbolizes the fight for freedom throughout Vietnam's history. Many Vietnamese citizens were probably alive to see both wars. The image of their soldiers played on the pride of the past by depicting the warriors as continuing the struggle of previous generations. Another key piece of this art is the depiction of modernization, innovation in agriculture, and factories which benefited Vietnam. By promising this in the artwork, they offered a good incentive for supporting the revolution. The last notable art on the cover is the depiction of Ho with Lenin. This is impactful for a communist Vietnamese because Lenin was a key figure in establishing communism.
An interesting aspect of the Vietnam War is that it was one of the first ever battles shown on live TV. Showing the horrors of war on TV massively influenced the U.S. populace perception, and according to an article entitled Vietnam, the Television War, Americans were starting to watch more TV during the era of when the Vietnam War started. According to Peter Baistrup, the Director of Communications for the Library of Congress, says that this gave the American public a very biased and incorrect view on the war. Another point that reinforces this is a document recovered by Vietnamese soldiers. This document states that the communists plan to spread negative media about the U.S. in the press.
This North Vietnamese poster depicts Richard Nixon as a giant that is slaughtering people with a missile and a knife. There was already a bombing campaign in Vietnam that was brutal. Nixon ended the main campaign in Vietnam and started one in Cambodia to stop the supply for the insurgency. This operation was entitled Freedom Deal and yielded many civilian casualties. This operation opened the door for more action in Cambodia and Laos, although it was totally illegal. The North Vietnamese attacked the U.S. from many angles, some being historical and others being through U.S. action during the war. This is an example of the latter. Bombing has always been a very controversial topic of war because of its imprecise nature. The North exploited this. Although this poster was before the war in 1954, it gives us a good idea of the rhetoric being used. The South used the notion that the North was chaotic to encourage people to hop the border to South Vietnam for a better life. This next poster was published by the Joint United States Public Affairs Office. It depicts the preamble to the South Vietnamese Constitution and was intended to increase patriotism among the public of South Vietnam. They sound somewhat like the North advocating against imperialism. Something that may have played against them in this constitution, however, is their preaching of democracy. They denied the word of the people, and they declined to hold reunification elections, which would have shown and implemented the will of the people.
South Vietnam and the U.S. tried to highlight the positive aspects of war, encouraging patriotism and advocating against the policies of the North. And for those in the South, in their propaganda, they failed because, firstly, the U.S. was largely seen as imperialist by most Vietnamese people and U.S. citizens. They were defending the government who denied their people self-determination. The U.S.'s actions during the war didn't help either. This also makes it hard to push patriotism with a population that was divided and refused reunification by the very government that is now asking them to be patriotic. We would like to thank two major sources that helped this project immensely. The first is the Biographic Show on Ho Chi Minh. They provided vital information on Ho Chi Minh in their video, and it will be linked below. The second is a website called PsyWarrior.com, which has a large collection of propaganda. We used the Vietnam section to find out much of the propaganda shown in the video. Thanks for watching.